on to, I think it's about our 7th Gender Equity Network talk. We set up the Gender Equity Network because we wanted to explore the current understanding of equality, which is based on an assumption of 50-50 in gender terms, and we were keen to explore issues of fairness, and therefore we decided to set up the Gender Equity Network to explore some traditional assumptions about equality. And we've had a whole range of talks, which I think a number of you have been to. And yeah, Ben Dangerous Hine, as he's come to be known in certain circles, is going to talk to us about challenging the gender discourse of domestic violence, a really important subject these days as there's a increasing awareness about the issues which are also affecting men and boys. So if you can just give a warm welcome to Ben. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Belinda. I don't know where that nickname came from either, so I'm just as in the dark as you are. So I'm Dr. Ben Hine. I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of West London, as it says here, and what I wanted to do today, and I thank the Gender Equity Network for asking me to come and do this talk, is to talk a bit more broadly about where our perceptions of domestic violence come from and why they seem to be so deeply coloured by gender and concepts surrounding gender, and also to think about how the discourse and the dialogue that we have around domestic violence at the moment is inherently gendered and what that results in for victims and perpetrators of domestic violence and what the kind of results of that are. So thank you very much for coming for this kind of Christmas-themed talk. So what I'm going to be talking about today is looking at definition and statistics for domestic violence in the UK, exploring those a little bit preliminarily, and then talking about what stereotypes exist about domestic violence and where they might come from. Then I will look at some literature, mainly from the area of psychology, which looks at the effects that those perceptions then have on victims and perpetrators, both when they kind of self-evaluate, so the victims themselves, also the peers. So what happens when they go to their peers and say that they've been a victim of domestic violence? How is that coloured and influenced by gender? Also their experiences of the criminal justice system, so what happens when they report, if they report. And also just looking at some more general studies that just look at blanket perceptions using undergraduate students, members of the general public. And then finally looking at recommendations and future directions in terms of how we can start to break down some of these beliefs about domestic violence itself. I want to say this, because I say this before any of my talks. Obviously you're all here because you know it's about domestic violence, but I have to say, obviously I will be talking about domestic violence quite candidly, so if it makes anybody feel uncomfortable at any point, then obviously you're free to leave. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about theories of domestic violence, i.e. where domestic violence comes from and why, mainly because I would need a lot more time, and I would split the room a lot more than I'm about to anyway by talking about those theories. I'm more than happy to talk to people afterwards. I'm more focused on, based on what we know about our feelings about victims, how does that influence the victim experience, and to some extent the perpetrator experience as well. So the first thing I would like to ask the room is, what does domestic violence look like? The floor is anyone's. What does domestic violence look like? Yeah.
Every time a man beats a woman.
Okay, so every time a man beats a woman...
Meets, not beats. Meets.
Okay, every time a man meets a woman, so that's interesting. So, yeah, we can talk about that a bit more in depth. Any other definitions of domestic violence? What does domestic violence look like?
One partner trying to control another.
Okay, so one partner trying to control another, and I thought this would go one of two ways. Either someone would give me the answer that they knew I would want, or they would give me the answer that I'm about to try and give you anyway. Sorry?
Absolutely everything.
Absolutely everything, exactly. So more of the answers that we all would like to hear, but often we don't hear. So what I did is I also asked my first year psychology students what they thought domestic violence looked like, and they gave me much more along the lines of what I would expect to hear from a number of different members of the public if you ask them, which is this idea of a strong, physically imposing, intimidating male aggressively and physically assaulting a kind of a weaker, smaller female. And when you search domestic violence online, this is what comes up, and a lot of the images are along this line. So what we have to think about is why the image that many people's minds go to, not some of the people who answered in here, but why many people's minds go to this image of domestic violence. And you might think, because you're here and because I'm talking about this, that we've come a long way and people don't think about domestic violence in a gendered way anymore. They definitely do. And when you ask people about what domestic violence looks like, they might not believe this is what it looks like, but they give this as a ready answer for the stereotype of domestic violence. So there is still this idea in people's minds that it's a gendered problem or gendered crime, man towards a woman, and it's aggressive, and she's weak and defenceless, and he's strong and intimidating. So what I want to do firstly is look at, first of all, the legal definition of domestic violence and some of the statistics that are drawn from the Office of National Statistics crime survey in England and Wales to see what domestic violence actually looks like. So the definition is got a similar tone to the answers I was giving down the front, of being a lot more inclusive than the answers I got from my first year undergraduate. So any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive or threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members regardless of gender or sexuality. And this can encompass, but is not limited to, the following types of abuse: psychological, physical, sexual, although obviously we know there are a whole band of crimes that are separately legislated for, financial and emotional. So that definition, and it sounds very legal and legislative, is very neutral in its sense. It's describing any pattern of behaviour, it's very inclusive in terms of the behaviour that they're encompassing, and it explicitly states regardless of gender or sexuality. So it could be a man towards a woman, a woman towards a man, homosexual, heterosexual relationships. And when we look at the statistics about domestic violence in the UK, I'm just going to stay within the UK for this talk. When we look at the Crime Survey of England and Wales, which is a fairly, obviously that's a subjective term, fairly reliable source of statistical information, because it's a survey that is not based on reported crime, it's based on experienced crime across England and Wales, for the year ending March 2015, and we actually see some really interesting patterns with regards to gender. So whilst 27.1% of women have said that they have been the victim of domestic abuse since they were 16, so have 13.2% of men, which is quite a lot. When I first actually started getting into this area, I was that smashed my perception straight away, because I was expecting that to be a lot lower, if at all. A quarter of women and a sixth of all men will suffer domestic abuse in their lifetime, according to those statistics. And in the year ending March 2015, 1.3 million women, or 8.2%, but also 600,000 men had suffered some form of domestic abuse. Which again, for me, was a number that was higher than I was expecting, and that many people would expect, I think. And obviously, those of you who are mathematical will work out that that basically means that a third of all victims are male, which doesn't sound like a minority to me in many senses of the word. And out of those 1.3 million and 600,000, 1.1 million women and 500,000 men, that was partner abuse from someone they were in a relationship with. If we dig a little deeper into those statistics, we find even more interesting gendered information about the crimes that have been reported or that are reported in this survey. So of those who reported being a victim of domestic abuse once or more, 37% of men and 29% of women suffered forceful abuse. 61% of men and 63% of women suffered emotional or psychological abuse, of those who reported that they suffered once. There's only a 2% difference there, as you can see. And 16.8% of separated women and 8% of separated men suffered partner abuse from the partner that they had separated from. So again, we're getting the sense, the increasing sense here from the statistics, that it's not quite the gendered the extreme gendered picture that you would think if you saw that picture right at the start. If you dig down even further, you continue to see interesting patterns related to gender. So of the abused men, men suffered from more severe bruising or bleeding than women did, 6% versus 4%, and more internal injuries or broken bones than women, 2% to 1% respectively. So although those percentages are close, they're actually in the favour of men for those most severe injuries, which I find quite interesting. 30% of men and 47% of women have emotional or psychological problems related to their abuse. Again, more similar than you might think, or that might be suggested by the studies that I'll talk about in a bit. And 19 men and 81 women died at the hands of their partner across that time period. So out of that, about a fifth of those deaths were male. Again, depending on your definition, I don't think a fifth is the type of number or level of deaths that you can write off. If we go back a bit further, which we have to for these specific numbers, 6.2% of gay or bisexual men have said they suffered partner abuse across the year ending March 2009, and that was actually compared to 3.3% of heterosexual men. So many academic estimates put homosexual inter-partner violence at similar levels to heterosexual couples. The Crime Survey of England and Wales actually put abuse in those relationships as higher than heterosexual couples. And this is especially exaggerated for lesbian couples. 12.4% of lesbian women suffered more partner abuse compared to heterosexual women at 4%. And if we just take a look at the kind of maybe precursor patterns that you might argue, an NSPCC report in 2009 said that 18% of boys and 25% of girls had been victims of physical violence in a relationship. So when we think about those statistics compared to the image of domestic violence that is built up in our minds over time, in many, many people's minds that you ask, you say, describe a typical domestic abuse incident, and this is the picture that they will give you. We can see that the actual picture of abuse, according to statistics, is very, very different and inherently much, much more complicated. Not least because it's further complicated by the fact that we don't know whether how those incidences are tied to each other. We don't know whether they were one time or multiple incidences. We don't know where the violence came from in terms of whether it was reactionary or not, or in reaction to another form of violence. So the picture is essentially a lot more complicated than what many people go to in their minds. And we have to ask the question, where do those stereotypes regarding domestic violence come from? And why do we have them? Because they seem to be very prevalent. And before we do that, I just want to talk to you very quickly about social cognition. So social cognition is the way that we think about the social world around us. And we have a number of strategies that we use in terms of social cognition in order to make the world easier for us to understand. So examples of this are things like heuristics, otherwise known as rules of thumb. So a rule of thumb that you build up in your mind might be about your route to work in the morning. You know that a certain route is very busy at a certain time. You experience that and you build up a rule of thumb to avoid that road. And there are different types of heuristics. I won't go into it in much depth, but things like availability heuristics. So we're much more likely to believe information that is readily available to us. So when we see many more increased reports of terrorist attacks, we then tend to overestimate the likelihood of a terrorist attack then occurring within our home city. So it's about the availability of information and also representativeness. So if I was to say to you, there's a guy that I know, he's really, really muscular, he wears flamboyant outfits, is he a wrestler or is he an office worker? People are much more likely to say that he's a wrestler based on the representativeness of him of that category, even though in the UK there are thousands and thousands of more office workers than there are wrestlers. So it makes much more sense to play the odds and say it's an office worker. And we also have schemas. And schemas are representations of the world, basically systems of rules that help us to understand people and situations. An example I always give my students is the restaurant schema. So if you go to somewhere like Prezzo, it follows a very traditional restaurant schema. Yeah, so you go in, you get seated, you order off a menu, they bring you your food, and it follows a pattern that we come to expect from restaurants. you're all following a lecture schema of some kind, so you're not, well, none of you are asleep yet. You're not talking to each other, you're not just randomly shouting things at me because you know about how lectures go. Yeah? When you go to Wagamama's, and if you haven't you should, but if you go to Wagamama's it's completely different. And we have to adapt our schemas in order to deal with that information, because you go to Wagamama's, you have to sit with other people a lot of the time, which is terribly un-British. Don't care if it's so. And they bring you your food whenever it's ready, and they write on your menu and all these kind of things. So you have to adapt your schema in order to facilitate that understanding. And we have a lot of different types of schemas that help inform our understanding of the world. And what I want us to start doing is thinking about how these schemas might inform our understanding of domestic violence when it occurs. So we have person schemas, so you might have a schema for your best friend. So the behaviour that you expect from your best friend, and that could be you expecting them to drink a certain amount on a night out, or how they'll respond to you if you say that you have a problem. We also have role schemas, so about how certain groups of people are meant to act. So hopefully you would have the schema that if you approach a police officer, they'll take your claim seriously and they will try and help you, although we'll talk about how that's not necessarily the case. And we also, importantly for the lecture today, we have event scripts, how certain events are meant to go. And that's the same as the restaurant schema that I just talked about, the lecture schema. And that's where we might have a domestic violence schema. So if I was to say to someone, tell me how a domestic violence incident would go out, they would draw on their present understanding about, in order to tell me about that crime. And finally, we have self-schemas, which are obviously about yourself, and you build up information based on how you react to the world around you. And you say, well, I tend to do this, or I tend to do that. I tend to be loud, I tend to be quiet. And you use that to inform your future decision making. And one of the most important schemas that we build up across our lives is our gender schema. And this was proposed by Sandra Bem back in 1981. And these are networks of information regarding gender stereotypes and gender beliefs and norms. So we build up, and I've just spent 13 weeks getting undergraduates to scratch the surface of where concepts about gender come from. So I'm not going to try and do that in about 10 minutes. But basically, information about gender comes from a lot of sources. It comes from our parents, our siblings, our peers, the media, school. And it teaches us, so we build up a schema of how we are meant to act as a man or a woman, and how others are meant to act as men and women. And within those schemas, we tend to build up a system of stereotypes that have certain concepts, certain actions, certain behaviours, certain preferences, certain personality traits associated with masculinity and femininity, and therefore with men and women, because people tend to view that in a very binary way. And so we tend to build up this schema of men and masculinity as very aggressive, they're independent, strong, dominant, stoic, self-confident and sexually dominant. And on the other side, we build up this idea of what it means to be feminine and what it means to be a woman in terms of being non-aggressive, interdependent, weak, passive, emotional, caring and nurturing. Now, very important thing to say is that I'm not saying that all men are like that, and I'm not saying all women are like that. What I'm saying is that our brain naturally goes through this process of absorbing information about men and women in order to help us to understand the world. And because of the gendered messages that do exist within our society and our environment, this is the picture that we tend to build up as stereotypes. And obviously we encounter people that violate these every day. I'm none of these. I'm all of this. Okay, so I defy these every single day, but we build up these stereotypes in our minds. And interestingly, again, for this particular talk, based on the information around us, we tend to allocate the role of perpetrator in many, many different crimes, but particularly in terms of things like domestic abuse, sexual violence, to men, and the role of victim to women. Those identifiers sit very easily within our minds because they also sit very well within the rest of the patterns there. Because it makes sense that a perpetrator would be aggressive and independent and strong. So it's easy for us to fit those words within the male and female category. So, why is that important? Well, heuristics and schemas are there to cut down the workload of your brain. We are naturally very, very lazy when it comes to thinking about people. And when we see people, we like to be able to make a load of assumptions based on a lot of different things, whether they're men or women, whether they are white or black, or another ethnic minority, whether they are wearing a certain type of clothes. We like to make assumptions because then it cuts down the work that we have to do about them. And it's particularly useful to situations that are based on limited information, where we have to fill gaps in our memory or perception, and then guide us in these situations that are so uncertain. Now, the reason that's important is because it's easy to see how domestic violence and other crimes, such as rape and serious sexual assault, invoke this type of thinking because they are often unclear and complicated, and based on the dialogue or an interaction between two people, usually only. So think of a domestic violence scenario that's taking place within a home. You usually have two actors within that scenario, and bar that, what else do we have to go on other than the word of those two people? So it's very easy to see how this type of thinking and how these mental shortcuts come in to help us make sense of that situation, not only as observers, but also as actors within those situations. How could this have happened to me? Well, let me draw on the information I have in my mind. And also, victims often want to make sense of very scary and very upsetting and very threatening situations. And they do so by evoking this thinking about what is meant to be happening to them as a man or a woman. So I'm returning to this picture again because our domestic violence schema that we will have built up is based on a lot of different things from the world around us and a lot of interacting schemas. And this can be very obvious messages about domestic violence or very implicit messages about domestic violence. So some examples of explicit examples that shape our attitudes are things like the violence against women and girls strategy. Now, what does the naming of that strategy suggest to you about who are the victims of domestic violence? I mean, that could be a lecture in itself, the naming of that policy. But anyway, so the violence against women and girls strategy reinforces that position of victim as women, perpetrator as male. Other things that tend to do that. So we had a very groundbreaking storyline on the Archers this year. Any Archers fans in? I don't actually listen to the Archers, but I've heard a lot about it. But that presented, whilst it was groundbreaking in presenting its type of abuse, because it was this coercive control behaviour, and usually people think of physical aggression, it was still between a man coercively controlling a woman. So we still have that representation coming forward to us. Things like Hollyoaks, which other people might have watched in the room. There was a relationship between Maxine and Patrick, again, between a man and a woman, and the direction was purely from male towards female in terms of domestic violence. So we have a lot of representations, explicit representations in the media that says, this is domestic violence, this is what it looks like. And there are also, and this is one of the reasons I didn't touch on it, because it is a fierce debate, and it's ramping up, if anything, a lot of the theories about domestic violence are from this perspective. Yeah, so the Duluth model, for example, is based around the fact that domestic violence is a manifestation of patriarchy, and it's men controlling women. It's a gendered model. Now, I'm not going to comment on how far I agree or disagree with that model, but I don't think it's particularly useful in terms of its reinforcement of these kind of attitudes and these stereotypes, that it's a gender-specific and gendered-only crime. Only men do it and only women have it done to them. So there are lots of different ways that we have explicit reinforcement of this is domestic violence, have a look at this, but also implicitly, and this is what I was suggesting in terms of the gender stereotypes. So if we just quickly go back, implicitly it's a lot easier in our mind to categorise perpetrators along with masculine characteristics because they kind of fit. You know, if you think of a perpetrator of domestic violence, someone who's coercive or controlling, physically dominant and abusive, it fits within our existing knowledge of masculinity and what we believe men to be like in general. And it's the same with victims for femininity and for women. And it kind of, when we look at perpetrators and victims, there's often a complex power dynamic between those two, and people often associate a similar power dynamic between men and women. So it starts to fit very easily, implicitly in our minds, and gets organised very easily within our minds. And the problem with social cognition is that it goes wrong. So in certain scenarios, we can make inaccurate assumptions, and this happens all the time, often with very little consequence. We might think someone is someone that they're not based on what they're wearing or what they're doing. Sometimes I walk into exam halls to invigilate exams, and they will tell me to sit somewhere and to do the exam, and I go, no, I'm invigilating the exam, I'm a lecturer here. And they've made an assumption about me for whatever reason, obviously my youthful looks, but they've made a social cognition about me, and for me, it's fine, I'm like, no, I'm an invigilator, but in some scenarios, it can be very detrimental. For example, I'm about to talk about when the police turn up at your door, and they try to evaluate, based on their social cognitions, not the evidence before them, who the perpetrator in a domestic violence situation is. We'll talk about that now. So, we have this idea that we have stereotypes around domestic violence, and we have some idea of where they come from. Like I said, I could spend ages exploring that with you, about all the different places they come from. But what I'm more focused on, and what I think is more important, is what effect this has on our judgments and our perceptions of the crime and of those involved. In terms of victim perceptions, what I've done, with permission, is borrowed some information from a presentation that was given at the Male Psychology Conference in 2015 by Anisham Pierce, who I've been in contact with, as a clinical psychologist. She is in the process of getting this study published, but the findings, even though they're not published, are very interesting, because she interviewed 9 male victims of domestic abuse and asked them, obviously, about their experiences, and this is what she found. That they felt invisible. So one of the quotes was, I don't think they understand, I don't think that they think that women abuse guys at all. So just this idea of blindness towards male victims in general. That it's not viewed as a serious issue, that people laugh it off, they think, oh no, you can't be being abused. That real men don't seek help. And that was a big theme, and that was very tied into emotional expression, so real men should just kind of, if it has happened to them, which it probably hasn't, but if it has, they should just suck it up and get on with it, because that's what men do. We're stoic, and we're like a moving rock, waves just crash against us. That there's a very definite risk of being labelled as the abuser. And that's not just by the partner, but it's by law enforcement agencies that then respond to the incident. So they often feel that they are unable to call for assistance because they will only get labelled as the abuser, and that's the thing that comes up later on. That they have to pretend to be okay because no one understands and there's no one that they can talk to. I feel obligated to seem as if it was nothing, to keep my status within my circle of friends. I have to, act as if it was like, she hit me, fuck it, whatever, I'm cool, So even when they are acknowledging to themselves that they have been a victim of domestic abuse, they then still put a layer and a barrier up between allowing an acknowledgement of that experience with others. And also that they highlighted a lack of social support from their peers, and that peers often found it amusing in some way and did not give them the support that they were maybe, not even expecting, but what they would like. So that research very much fits in with what we've just been talking about in terms of the power of those stereotypes, is downplaying how valid we view people in those experiences. So the victims themselves feel that, and if we look at the statistics, they support that picture. Male victims, 29% of male victims, are therefore over twice as likely than women to not tell anyone about the partner abuse they suffer. Only 10% of male victims will tell the police, as opposed to 26% of women. And at this conjuncture, I would just add, I'm not downplaying the seriousness of the fact that only 26% of women report to the police at all. What I'm saying is that people often ignore the fact that it's lower for men. Only 23% of men will tell a person in an official position, as opposed to 43% of women. Only 11% will tell a health professional, as opposed to 23% of women. And 80% of men who call the Mankind Initiative helpline have never spoken to anyone about the abuse they are suffering at all. So you will see on that slide, the men are consistently on the wrong, in inverted commas, side of those statistics in terms of who they feel able to tell, who they want to tell, and how often they do it. And again, I would stress, this is, domestic abuse, things like sexual abuse, men and women suffer from chronically low reporting rates. and there are gender reasons why that is as well, but what we are often ignoring is the fact that it's often worse for men because of those additional layers, which we'll talk about in a second in terms of threat to masculinity. And then when we look at the peers, so Anna Schumpeers also did focus group with 19 young adults who didn't know the people that were in the first interview section. They were just young, carefree New Zealanders. And they came up with some interesting themes as well when talking about domestic violence and how they would react if someone told them, and this was men and women, that they inherently view men as powerful. So when you ask them about how they would react, they say things like, well, he kind of let her do all that. If that happens with a guy, he's the type of guy who is willing to be pushed over by women. This is Piers saying this about if someone came to you. It's not massively encouraging. That men inherently can't be manipulated because they are in control of the situation. Deep down, I feel like she can't do anything to him because he's able to stop her if he wanted to at any point. And I feel that he has autonomy to be like, hey, that's not okay, I'm going to leave you if you do it again. So men are just free to go whenever they want because they're strong and they're in control of the situation. And that they could leave easily. Also, there was a big theme of that men don't need our help. If they came to someone with a domestic violence problem, that they don't need our help. People just think that men are really privileged. There's no way that they should deserve help. There's the one that's seen with more money, they're the ones that are seen with more power, so it's kind of like, well, if they really wanted help, they could just get it if they needed it. So there's a whole other layer of saying, well, even if they did feel like they needed help, it would just be freely available, because men are privileged, aren't they? Every privilege has a downside. Men tend to have more power, and that's why you just think that they don't need any help, like they have authority, so why would they need help? And also, the last theme, that women are incapable of...
Oh dear.
We've been shut out.
Sorry about that.
It's alright.
No, we haven't
I'll
been
keep
shut
going.
out.
I'll keep talking.
Okay.
That women are incapable of harm, which we see from the statistics that that's simply not the case at all. Did I do something? Have I missed
No,
something?
that's, do you know what? Sometimes this thing overheats and it needs to shut itself down. Okay, so it's just shutting itself down. It will restart.
Okay. Use me as your visual prompt. I think men are seen or perceived to not be able to be hurt, by a woman because a woman is weak and a man is strong. And what damage could a woman do anyway, even if they did hit you? So with the converse feeling of men are strong and dominant and powerful, so there's no way that they could be abused. There's the converse stereotype that women are weak and powerless and fragile, so all they would be doing is coming at you with their tiny little fists of fury, and there's nothing that they could do towards you or hurt you. Whereas we see from the statistics that men are actually the ones who are suffering the graver injuries. Now, there's no way to break down that data to see if all of those particular men were in homosexual relationships, which might be the only way they could suffer those injuries is if they were with another man. But I would say that was probably very unlikely, that all of those men who suffered those severe injuries happened to be in homosexual relationships with another man. And from academia, thank you, John, academia also supports this idea that men feel they have a lack of support from social network and also from services. And services tend to react in the same way with ideas of disbelief and a very questioning nature. And I'm really glad it's come back on because I've got an example to show you of how peers might react. And I've shown this before in my male psychology talk, so anyone who's seen it before, I apologise. But I do think it's one of the best representations of our cultural view of domestic violence towards women.
Katie. Hey everyone, this is Katie.
Hi.
So you ready to go?
Yes, go in the bathroom.
Oh sure, right back there.
Hey, where we going?
I was thinking maybe Chinese food.
Oh, I love Chinese! How'd you know I love Chinese? She's so cute. You could fit her right in your little pocket.
So first of all, you can fit her right in your little pocket, so that's straight away going in with the fact that she's small and she's tiny and capable of harm.
I don't know. I mean, I like her a lot, and she's really nice.
Joe Tribbiani is obviously
But what?
a big man.
She keeps punching me.
In the cute little sweet way she just did?
Hey, it's a lot harder than it looks. Okay? She's hurting me.
I know what you need. You need a bodyguard. Hey, Ross, what has Ben doing after preschool?
Hey, listen, Joey's having a problem. This little girl is beating him up.
Oh, Joey, come here. Look. Honey, I know this must be really, really difficult for you. And, well, I'm sorry, am I hurting you? You were so funny in that way. You're such a nut!
You know, breadstick fangs are always funny, so...
No, you make them funny. You're the funny one!
Look, Katie, listen, we need to talk, okay? Look, I like you. I really do. I like you. Okay? But sometimes when you playfully punch me like that, it feels like someone's hit me with a very tiny but a very real bat.
Oh, like I could hurt you. Are you making fun of my size? Don't make fun of me because of my size!
Thanks, I've been working out. Hey, listen, is it obvious I'm wearing 6 sweaters?
Yeah. But it's not obvious why.
Well, look, I'm breaking up with Katie, so I had to put on some extra padding. You know, I mean, if she hits me when she's happy, can you imagine how hard she's gonna hit me when I tell her I'm taking away the Joey love?
Hey, cute jacket. Oh, thanks. That's so sweet. Oh, ow. Did Joey tell you to say that? You guys are too much. You know what? I gotta tell you, I think you're the one that is too much. Oh, Joey has the nicest friends. Oh, and the nicest girlfriend. Oh, you're so sweet. Whoa, you're so sweet. Joey, he just kicked me.
Huh.
Aren't you gonna do something? You better do something or I'm gonna walk out that door right now. Well, are you gonna?
Nah.
So for me, there are lots of interesting questions there to be asked about that situation. And one of the most interesting ones for me to ask is, if you flip the genders, how sinister does that series of scenes become? Because he's visibly scared of her, he's going out of his way to kind of avoid physical contact, he's clearly scared, he spills his coffee, he puts on all those jumpers. The only way he can get out of that relationship is by allowing like a third party situation to resolve it for him. He hasn't exited that situation, he hasn't gone, this person's punching me, it's hurting me, I'm going to leave this situation. And rewinding right to the start, the friend's reaction, is obviously one of mockery and disbelief as well. So I like to use that because it's a really good example of how, if those roles were gender inverted, we'd have a very different scene or set of scenes on our hands. And this unfortunately does spill over into male victims' experiences of the criminal justice system. And this is work by Jessica Carrick up at Teesside that was published earlier this year. And the themes that we get here are similar and build upon the themes that we got with the peers. So these are men who had been victims of domestic abuse and had gone to the report to the police about it. They felt there was this guilty until proven innocent vibe. So basically, not only by society, who would say, well, you must have done something to initiate that perpetration, or it was actually you who was provoking, it was actually you who was doing it, but also by the partner, interestingly. So the partner would use this as a manipulation tool and say, well, if you call the police, I'm just going to say that you beat me up. And how readily would the police believe that? Very readily. And also, yeah, by the criminal justice system, and many men reported that upon calling the police would turn up and arrest them instead. In terms of masculine identity, many of the men felt that society's view of male victims was very negative, and we've just seen that. That they felt challenged in their own masculine identity, and that is so important in terms of the experience of victims. They've become a victim, and to them, that was fundamentally at odds with their idea of masculinity and of being a man, and it had fundamentally undermined them as a man. And that is very impactful on kind of psychosocial adjustment. And also, interestingly, the criminal justice system had an idea of masculinity. I mean, they're an incredibly masculine institution, and the way they operate is very masculine. But they had an idea of what masculinity is like and should be, and whether you should have been a victim or not. And they evaluate you as such. That they felt that there was this pressure cooker building, which is not a particularly male theme, it's just a theme that we've identified in males as well. This idea that there was an ongoing building negative psychological impact, and we see that in female victims as well. And interestingly with this study, and in a nice way, that there was this light at the end of the tunnel theme that came, and that they were using their experiences for good, but it was still off the back of pretty terrible experiences with the criminal justice system. And there's a whole raft of research, which I'm just going to click up on the screen here, from psychology that mirrors this qualitative work that show that male victims report poor satisfaction with care from officers. Female perpetrators are more likely to receive lower sentences if it gets to court or have their cases dismissed. Male victims are more likely to be blamed for their victimisation than female victims. So within that dialogue, they're much more likely to say, well, we acknowledge you're a victim, but did you do something to provoke that attack? And male victims believe themselves that officers won't be able to help to a greater extent than female ones. So female victims believe this as well, but male victims believe it to a greater extent. And the prejudice against men or male victims is very extreme, and there's a specific link to underreporting, and more men being put into the system if countercharges are made. So if a man, basically when you get arrested, if you then countercharge against the other person, many more men have that countercharge upheld against them than women do. The same actions are judged as actionable when performed by men as opposed to women, so in terms of making arrests and acting upon those actions. And male victims are sometimes actually completely ignored by the police or other services, not only in their response but also in their training, etc., etc. And there is a lack of funding for male services. There's many more statistics that support that, especially for the Mankind Initiative. But there is a distinct lack of funding for male services as well. And then finally, when we look at general perceptions, this is where some of, for me, the most interesting results come, is that there are lots of different variables that mean that male and female victims are evaluated differently, male and female perpetrators are evaluated differently. And when you look at the different pairings, so heterosexual versus homosexual relationships, they're also evaluated differently. So severity, scenarios with male victims are rated as less severe. Scenarios with female perpetrators are rated as less severe, and male-female scenarios are considered the most serious out of all those different pairings. Interestingly, female-female are the lowest because it involves two women who couldn't possibly do any damage to each other because they would just basically just bounce off each other because they couldn't do any real harm. The resolution suggestions that are given by participants are very interesting. So when it's involving a male victim, participants are much more likely to say, I would just leave him alone, I would just leave him to it. Whereas in female victim scenarios, they want to call the police. Much more likely to call the police. When they are asked about the action by the police, they're more likely to recommend an arrest when a female victim is involved than a male victim. Responsibility, which for me is one of the most interesting factors, male victims are more responsible for their victimisation than women, which plays very much into this idea of, well, you must have done something to deserve it. And also sentencing, when you get to the actual end of cases, participants recommend higher penalties for male perpetrators over female perpetrators. There is less on homosexual relationships themselves, but the literature suggests that domestic violence is just as common in these relationships, and the stats show it's actually probably more common, that it's chronically misunderstood, chronically under-investigated, not just in terms of being investigated by police, but by academics, such as myself, that there's real heterosexism within lots of different circles, lots of different institutions, lots of different policies that specifically kind of exclude acknowledgement of homosexual relationships. They also tend to be very influenced by gendered beliefs. So many people have this idea that, well, there's two converse theories, is that homosexuals are gender inverts, so gay men are inherently feminine, lesbian women are inherently masculine, which presents its own problems in judging those dynamics. Or people think to themselves, we've either got two men who are fighting, and they can both defend themselves because they're both big and strong, so no problem. Or you've got two women fighting who can barely hurt each other because they're two women and they're both weak, so they'd just be weak against each other. So again, you have no problem. So again, there's an intersection there between sexuality beliefs and also inherent things like inherent for institutionalised homophobia and heterosexism interacting with gendered beliefs that make homosexual incidences of domestic violence even further off the radar than incidences involving a female perpetrator and a male victim. But that research that has been done shows that these instances are just fundamentally viewed as less serious, just in general. No matter who it involves, whether it's two women or two men, they're just less serious. And finally, this is current research that I am doing, and I hope to finish the data collection in 2017, but the preliminary pilot findings show that severity mirrors the previous findings, responsibility mirrors the previous findings, and interestingly in our study, we see a really big difference in humour. I.e., nobody rates domestic violence as funny, but people rate incidences of a female perpetrator and a male victim as neither funny nor unfunny. Whereas when it's a male perpetrator and a female victim, it's obviously, I don't know what I'm doing here, sorry. It's obviously really, it's not funny at all. So whilst I'm not saying that people are like, ha ha ha, look at that domestic violence, they're neutral towards it, which is bizarre to me. And it's not what we have seen before in social experiments that are done out of We have an incident here of a man abusing a woman in public. We see the reaction here.
Get your hand off me! Stop it! People are being scared. What's wrong with you? Thanks. Okay, can someone call the police if you can do that to someone?
Okay.
If I don't, someone else.
So we're seeing a real life mirror of the results we saw from the study. So they view it as very severe. They recommend you to call the police.
I'm correct, thanks.
What happens when we reverse?
10 minutes and you haven't listened. You haven't got an input from what I've been saying to you. But you're fucking not even listening to me, that's what. Why do I push you like that? Because you won't fucking respond to me and you won't listen to me. You think you're fucking old manly.
I was.
No, you can't be. No, you can't be. Don't try and fucking walk away. Stop. Listen to me when I'm talking. Don't try and fucking walk away from me. Stop it. What the fucking bullshit? What the fucking bullshit? What's wrong with me? There's nothing. Don't give me that shit. Okay?
Very different reactions. And that is the real life manifestation of those beliefs, because those people, I assume, will be thinking in that scenario, it's less serious, the man has control in that situation, the woman is smaller and weaker so she couldn't possibly hurt him. All of these beliefs that come into our judgments of those crimes. So what we have is a picture where it seems to me very clear that we have a picture of domestic violence from statistics that is not gendered. As in, it's nowhere near as exaggerated as our mind's perception of domestic violence would have us believe. So we have many, many men a year who suffer from domestic violence. We have domestic abuse in homosexual relationships. However, when we ask people to judge these scenarios, when we take people out and about and do social experiments, we see these fundamentally different reactions when you swap the genders. And when we ask ourselves why that is, hopefully you guys kind of buy what I've just told you in terms of that amassing of gender stereotypes and how that influences the nature of how we judge those crimes. Now I'm going to talk briefly, just for the last 10 minutes, about how we can change this. And the reason I've put and why we should want to is because for everyone in here, hopefully, and for me, as a personal opinion, for me it's obvious because we have victims. It doesn't matter whether they are women or men. However, when you look at the current initiatives that we have in place, it would be very easy to think that we don't care about male victims at all, and why should we? And that's for me, a very dangerous place to be. So in terms of what I think needs to happen is that we need to be tackling this at a number of different levels. Some are more achievable than others. In terms of the political narrative, and I know Mark Brooks has spoken about this on a number of occasions, but the political narrative tends to be very gender exclusive at the moment. And we've just seen the Istanbul Convention today I think it's maybe being presented towards the House of Commons tomorrow, and that is a completely gender biased document that a number of countries are signing up to around Europe that specifically outlines things like domestic abuse as a gendered issue that is perpetrated by men towards women. Now, if you are a male victim of domestic abuse and you see initiatives and policy and legislation at the highest level in terms of being adopted across Europe, how does that fundamentally make you evaluate and feel about your abuse? And for me, it's exactly the same as the Vogue strategy. Now, Ali Fogg has done great work at getting Alison Saunders to put a little sentence on the bottom saying, also includes data on men and boys. Like it's a little extra tagline that should make you feel better about being a male victim. But the strategy itself, and brackets, all the funding that goes alongside that, is violence against women and girls. So fundamentally in your mind, how does that build up a picture to you in terms of your abuse that you may have suffered? And I have a lot of gripe with the Vogue strategy beyond many people, because I actually think things like that reinforce not only the position of men as perpetrators, but the position of women as victims. I think it does a greater disservice, and it's the same thing, same problem I have, and I wrote a blog post about this, about the Nottinghamshire hate crime classification, misogynistic hate crime. Now, hate crime and sexual harassment is obviously a very big problem, I'm not denying that, but what I'm saying is by enshrining misogynistic hate crime in law, what we're basically saying is not only that men are particularly dangerous and particularly likely to harass you and grab you on the street, we're reinforcing the idea and this space in women's minds and men's minds about women as victims as well. And what happens is if you're a man and you become a victim, what you're having to grapple with is just a fundamental violation of how you view yourself in relation to the world. So it's no wonder why they don't report and that they have psychological problems associated as well. Because you're thinking, wow, maybe I'm fundamentally just not anywhere near the person I thought I was. That's a really big thing. Because, and I don't say this, I mean it's very clear, I don't say this to undermine the experiences of women, but when women are domestically abused and sexually assaulted, unfortunately, because of those stereotypes we build up, it does actually fit more easily within their own conceptualizations of their victimization. So it can be a shock in the extent that domestic abuse is always a shock and sexual violence is always a shock and a terrible thing, but it's less of a fundamental deconstruction of how we understand the world when it is when men become victims. And I want to stress that's not undermining the experience of female victims at all, but it's just saying for too long we've ignored and asked the opposite question. And things like training and policy within professional bodies, and we're seeing it fall between a rock and a hard place at the moment, because either we have training that is gender biased and just talks about women, or we see training that doesn't talk about gender at all. And there are problems with each of those, because if you don't talk about gender at all, you're not addressing the specific problems that men have when they become victims. Academia needs to do better. We haven't done enough, and I'm trying to lead a group of academics, the Domestic Violence Against People Network, who are looking to try and do more research outside of that traditional pairing, male perpetrator, female victim. But we need to do more, and we need to have a much more open and less combative conversation about our models of domestic violence. Because if you say that you disagree with the Duluth model, then you're not worthy of doing domestic violence research. And I just think that that is all part of the needless gender war that we are engaged in. But we need to be better at coming up with broader, more inclusive explanations of domestic violence as well. And I'm not saying by any means that male victims read academic papers, but the fact that the research, the statistics, I mean, the ONS is to blame as well. I've emailed the Office of National Statistics a number of times because their breakdowns for male victims are not as extensive and therefore not as important. I want to know how many of those were partners, how many of those were dates. This information doesn't exist, it's not recorded. Why? Why isn't it recorded? Why is it less important? They're all victims. The media needs to play their part as well, and there are some examples of where they are doing this. There was a long-running line on Hollyoaks. It's not like my favourite show, but it's good for groundbreaking narratives because Stay and Brendan had an abusive homosexual male relationship, and EastEnders also tackled this. And I will just very quickly show you a little bit of Tina and Tosh interacting.
Just thinking of you. When it doesn't happen, it just makes me feel bad inside.
So bad you couldn't even answer my calls earlier? Or come back and see me?
I did come back, actually. You was asleep.
Right, so where were you? When I called you?
I was at work. You know I was.
How come you stink of booze?
I went to the Vic.
On your own?
Oh, Tosh, please don't do this. I was with Johnny.
Of course you were.
I was. We were playing
You
darts.
with someone else?
No.
You answer your phone, you sneak out. Are you seeing another woman? You want to be free, you want to do your own thing, you don't want to get tied down to me. You've never wanted me to have this baby.
That is not true. Why do you keep saying that?
Because you don't care about me.
Of course I care. Tosh, please don't do this.
We're getting drunk in the pub while I'm here having lost our baby. Okay, you haven't lost anything. There was no baby. That's exactly what you wanted, isn't it?
Why'd you say that?
Do you want us to have a kid? You've got your lovely family in the pub, haven't you? You've got your brother and your sister, your little niece and nephews.
Oh, maybe it wasn't meant to be.
Look, stop it, all right? I said I'm sorry for that. I didn't mean it. What is it? You're scared. You're scared, aren't you? I'm going to be a proper good mum, not like you, screwing everything up with Jar Jar. You're jealous. But I'm going to have something I can love properly instead of you.
So that's a representation we haven't seen before, which is great. And I love, Chrome actually said, I've detected unusual behaviour. So we need more representations like that in the media because that's one of the main ways that we pick up information about gender in the world around us is through the media. And so having those representations will make people go, oh, a woman just punched a woman. That's expanded my mind a little bit about what women are capable of. More broadly than this, we need to think about maybe also tackling the much broader systems of gender that we kind of let envelop our young boys and girls and the messages that we give them. One of the key examples for me is about emotional expression in boys. There are hundreds of studies that show that we systematically push boys away from emotional expression. Now, if we made inroads in not doing that quite so much and allowed them to be more emotionally expressive, would they then feel more able as victims to talk to people in support networks? It's the same thing that ties into things like male suicide, is one of the reasons that we have such a gendered issue in terms of suicide, because men feel that they can't be emotionally expressive and can't approach peers when they have problems. So there's also a question there for me to be asked about how we tackle this from when boys and girls are young, how we teach them about gender and relationships from when they are very young as well. Most importantly, and what I would always say to people is, domestic violence is a crime that is deeply coloured by gender, but it's not a gendered crime. And many people use that phrase to describe things like domestic abuse, things like rape and serious sexual assault. But we have to acknowledge the impact that gender has, because it clearly does have an impact on how the victims make sense of their own experience. And this is what I was mentioning about social policy and training. If you go too far and just go, right, we're going to be gender neutral, which I think is what Philip Davis wants to achieve on the Women and Equalities Committee. If you go too far, then you tend to ignore the experiences, because gender is something that we live our lives through as a prism every day. Our experiences are affected by it. So if you ignore it, then you're actually doing a similar disservice than if you were gender biased in the first place. But what we need to do is, because we have this increasing dialogue about gender and how the construct of gender influences and interact with our lives, we have to be able to understand more about the stereotypes that are associated with domestic abuse, with things like harassment, with things like rape and serious sexual assault, in order to be able to provide victims with what they need. And the final thing I would say is that the ideas that I have talked about are the lived experience for male and female, homosexual and heterosexual men and women and victims daily. And it's our duty to challenge our perceptions of domestic abuse as they currently stand. Because if we fail to address gender and its influence adequately on how we perceive these crimes and on victims' experience, then we fail to give the victims the compassion, the support, and the recognition that they all fundamentally deserve. And I think that's what we as a society owe victims of domestic abuse. And one of the ways we can do that is by making those steps that don't fundamentally undermine the experience of some victims over others. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening. Does anybody, do we have brief time for?
Yeah, we definitely do. So Ben, fantastic, really good. And I think in a sense quite dangerous, because for a lot of people they will find it threatening.
Yeah, well, there you go.
It challenges the narrative. So we do have time for questions. Would anybody like to ask a question?
It strikes me that one of the definitional failures of the Duluth model is that is how it deals with same-sex domestic violence.
Yeah.
And I would personally suggest putting the experience of gay men, gay women at the centre of things when constructing a sufficiently robust model to deal with same-sex, because if there isn't an obvious man to arrest, then police would have to actually, you can't throw them back on a situation where they don't have an obvious person to arrest, unless you give them training of how do we interpret this. And whatever model of domestic violence you come up with has to be robust enough to work in the context of a same-sex domestic violence, and then hopefully you'd be able to reapply that back out into heterosexual relationships.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think what the kind of increasing dialogue over maybe the past 5, 7 or 8 years, one of the main challenges that has been put forward to the Duluth model is, how does this explain homosexual relationships? And the reason that that's never been asked is because there's a lot of questions that we have never asked about homosexual relationships because of other issues within our society about homophobic beliefs, and the fact that the dialogue about homosexual relationships in general has only been really increasing and entering the public consciousness over the last 30, 40 years. So I totally agree, and that's one of the key kind of aims of the network that we put together, is to really kind of highlight those groups and do research on those groups and put those groups at the forefront in an area that they've hardly been considered at all, essentially, and it even further undermines their experience than, say, male victims of female victims.
It strikes me that that's probably the single fundamental definition of weakness of Duluth. That obviously it's not enormous whole thing, but that's one of them.
Yeah, I agree.
Working with domestic abusers, both males and females, another thing which fits quite nicely within what you've described today is also what happens with female abusers that are now sent on the Freedom Programme, where they are cast as victims, obviously, and the content of the Freedom Programme then is a discourse about 6 or 8 male abusers, completely ignoring the fact that the woman herself might, as we had worked with a woman in Birmingham last month, recognised that she was the abusive person in the relationship, and is then afterwards being compelled by social services to attend the Freedom Programme just to make sure that she realises that she's really a victim of all of that.
And that's one of one of the additional problems with those stereotypes is that and the social cognition is that when we have an experience or when we identify someone that is contrary to our expectations, we rationalise it in some way. And I think that is an example of rationalising in our minds how a woman could become a perpetrator or be a perpetrator, is thinking, well, the only way that could be a scenario is if she was also a victim. Whereas we would never have the same cognition with a man, because he fits already within our, it's like perpetrator, men, okay, it all fits. Whereas we have that challenge, and it's the same challenge that we have with male victims of sexual assault and rape. We have that same challenge within our minds of having to rationalise that heinous act and trying to make sense of it and what essentially is the harm.
Another criticism of Duluth underneath all of that, of course, is that many of the abusers that we work with have also experienced had shocking experiences of children.
Yeah.
Of course, those are not permitted to be brought into Duluth's model, because that's just forming an excuse of blaming their parents for the way.
Yeah.
Move on is the nonsense which they say. So.
I think what we've fallen into the trap of politically, policy-wise, training-wise, and in academia, and I don't speak on behalf of academia, but one of the things that they've identified is oversimplifying what is an incredibly complicated issue and problem, and coming up with models that I just think fundamentally do a disservice to everybody they're trying to explain their experience of. And I think we need to have, one of the issues with that, unfortunately, is that not many people want to hear a debate that doesn't fall under, I'm going to be very careful with what I term here, what you might call a classic feminist narrative. So people aren't very willing to open up and talk in a way that addresses male issues, because it's not part of the broad narrative, and that's what Mark Brooks has talked about. It's not part of that broad narrative at the moment. And I think that's just terribly sad, because so much of what we do is pitting men against women, male issues against female issues. Well, I've always conceptualised it as that we're both fighting against the construct of gender and how it binds and restricts us all. That's the only way I've ever conceptualised it. So, and I just think, when do we get to a point where branding 500 or 600,000 victims of domestic abuse every year is acceptable, but just because they're male? That's never really sat well with me, which is obviously why I'm here.
It could be seen as an example of what Martin Seeger has termed male gender blindness.
Yeah,
which is a kind of cognitive bias which leads us just to somehow or other not see bad things happening when they're happening to men.
Yeah. And that's only reinforced by policy and politics at the highest level, really. We're starting to see cracks emerge, and we're chipping away slowly, and anybody who wants to learn more about the Men and Boys Coalition, which is the coalition that we've just set up, bringing together charities, academics, third sector parties to try and create a constructive space for male issues and to lobby government to kind of address it in a more gender inclusive way rather than this gender blind way.
This gentleman here.
Hi Ben, actually by the way, the official stats on domestic violence is already actually against dads who have to leave with their children. Where do they go? What do they do? How many refuges are available within the UK? Because when I set up Dad's house, there were 66 mother and baby hostels in London. Not one for dads. No. Not one for dads anywhere in the UK actually.
So
there's never been a point of contact.
No.
Where a man, whether it's gay, straight, dad, or anything that it can go to and pour his hat out, so it's an anti-tell.
Yeah.
Where you've got all those charities, they've got millions and hundreds of thousands of pounds of funding collectively. They've never helped another charity. And I've been doing this for 10 years. And the Men's and Boys Coalition, how many people are here from the Men's and Boys Coalition? I mean, this should be this night united, where people are actually coming to support you guys in this lecture.
Well, the thing is I'm happy there are so many people here. I wasn't expecting so many people, and that's part of an expectation that I think we've all built up about talking about male issues, and I'm sure you felt the same way. The increasing attendance at the male psychology conference. It's not popular. People don't want to hear it. People don't want to talk about it. And the thing is I come from a place where I think if there's even one victim from any type of background, then there should be support for them. But it amazes me on the other side of that thinking that 600,000 people can be ignored just because they have a penis.
But do you think men help men? They talk a good game, they want, but what do they do, and what actually do they do in the practical terms?
Well, there are a number of
I'm
issues.
asking,
I'm not. There are a number of issues with that because it's all marred in this gender politics. So gender politics has become quite a popular term recently. Everyone's having to define their gender politics. You know, I've already received a lot of flack for identifying as a feminist and all this kind of thing. So I think that to talk about male issues is a tricky one. To talk about it with other men, people are very quick to form their own opinions about what you're trying to do, who you're trying to do it for, where you belong on the gender politics spectrum, whether you're a men's rights activist or not. And combine that with a kind of socialised dislike for talking about issues between men and to other people, then you have a very hostile environment in order to address those issues, I think.
But do you think, I'll go back to saying what said, it's because there's not an actual centre, a man's centre.
But that in itself...
There should be, no?
Well, but not everybody understands the place that I'm coming from. So if I say I think that there should be a violence against women and boys, men and boys strategy, which I do think there should be one, people don't like that because it doesn't fit in with the grand narrative.
Yeah, but no one's going to agree with everybody anyway, so that doesn't make any difference. But someone has to make a difference and make a stand and say, listen, this is what should be done, actually.
Well, I think that's what we're trying to achieve with the Men and Boys Coalition, is finally trying to get people from all sides of the spectrum together and saying, regardless of your gender politics, regardless of your actual politics, and regardless of, whether you're feminist, anti-feminist or whatever, I mean, we don't accept any form of prejudice or anything like that, but regardless of where you come from, we're trying to get together, and I think that's what we're trying to do, is create and lobby for a space for a constructive conversation about male issues, and not one that is inherently pitched on the opposite side of female issues. We made it very clear, we want more funding for domestic abuse against men and centres and refuges, not at the detriment of women's centres and refuges. But in addition, and I'm saying that's what we're trying to promote as a way of thinking, is it's not about pitching those two groups against each other, it's about acknowledging that the two groups exist and they have a gendered experience.
And if I can just kind of jump in a bit. One of your questions was, I think, do men help each other as much as good? I think that male gender blindness affects everybody, men and women. I think we all don't really, it's a struggle to kind of to see when men are having problems. We all tend to think that they must be coping, they must be okay. For lots of reasons, we just don't seem to see it.
I'm talking about organisations, actually, not individuals. I'm talking about organisations who pretend to do things. They write policies, we can do this, but we didn't actually pick up that phone. No one's picking the phone.
I would agree we need more of it, but I understand the hostile context in which it's occurring, and it is a challenge.
Okay, interesting stuff. Let's move on to this gentleman.
Men do help other men. We just don't help in the way that women help men. And we have a very gendered, it's very, very gendered because women have had the lead on this for several decades. Men don't necessarily want a centre. We haven't developed the language, we haven't developed the mindset to actually look at what men's needs are. I mentor a lot of young men and I tell them, take care of your needs. Food, clothes, shelter, one person who loves you and accepts you as you are and doesn't want to change you, and one person who you love and accept as they are and don't want to change. They don't have to be the same person. Those are your needs. Cover those and you're fine, you're clear, you're home and dry for the rest of your life. And I think we're much more simple and less complex. This idea of the centre, we could have that, but would men turn up? I mean,
so whether,
experience running the shelter, would men work together or would they compete against each other?
This is exactly what I'm saying about acknowledging that this is a crime affected by gender but isn't a gendered crime, because I would love to live in a happy, clappy, lovely utopia where gender doesn't exist, and I'm not going to get into a debate about at what level those differences are innate or socialised. I think they're massively socialised, but whatever. The point is that gender is a lived experience for us every day. So the point is that we need to make whatever services that we come up with and whatever training we do appropriate to the gender that we're targeting it towards and acknowledging the lived experience that they have. So providing a female-based centre or female-based training, I mean, it's the same reverse model of why do we put all women in prison systems designed for men? It's the same kind of question. Why would we try and approach therapy the same way with men than we do for women? And I'm the last person who wants to reinforce gender stereotypes, believe me. I try and break them all the time, but it's not going to help anybody if we just pretend that they don't exist or we try to move too quickly to a position where they don't affect our thinking. The first step that we need to do at the moment is acknowledge that people of all different genders, all different sexualities are affected by domestic abuse and create services and needs that are adequate for those who suffer from such abuse.
One more thing. I mean, I agree with you about we've launched housing, and it's the first in Europe for homeless single dads, where we've taken on 4 dads who were victims of domestic abuse, and to see the children food and housing, that's the key basics for any man or woman actually, and we do that, you know. But so I disagree with you where when men access shelter, absolutely they would.
But that's for children. That's
Well, no, it's not.
Gents, this is one for the pub later on.
my experience myself is very different.
From over here.
Yeah.
I was quite surprised to see you have something up here about financial abuse. I just wondered if you should just give some information about that.
Yeah, so that's one of the areas of domestic abuse that's only recently kind of got any research attention, been recognised, because it's a very subtle form of, well, it can be subtle, it cannot be, but basically financial abuse is exerting that coercion or power through financial means. So that might be confiscating someone's credit card and saying they can only have it back when they behave. It might be insisting that all of their earnings or their money go through your account and you give them an allowance. It can range, but that's one of the areas that's not quite so frequently kind of acknowledged. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I worked with male perpetrators with the Duluth model for a short period of time. You're talking about domestic violence as perpetrator and victim. What I saw in the group of the men, because I just worked with the men, was that the women were violent as well. Their violence was often just dismissed. But what I saw from their stories is that they're in codependent violent relationships, and that's not what's been brought up here.
Yes, you're quite right. You're quite right, and often a lot of the studies do that because of the way that we have to design them. Because if you introduce too many factors, then they start to become meaningless, and the results won't make any sense. But I completely agree that part of the criticism that I made earlier of many models and of some of these researchers and the statistics themselves is that it's oversimplifying often a very complicated situation. And like you said, often couples are engaged in intimate partner terrorism, where they are both abusive. There's no clear perpetrator or victim defined. And that just adds another layer to the problem of the fact that so many people have to categorise the world in that way, and when they do so, they allocate gender in the way that would be expected. So you're 100% right, and I think that maybe that's something else we can address in the network, is looking at how that plays in as a factor in people's judgments and how that affects how they view these and into future models as well. So look at cycles of violence rather than one-time perpetration.
Hi, I'm actually a graphic designer, so I only have so many limited knowledge. One question I had was something like the social media things where you have your second life with your friends that you don't actually see, you don't have any contact with. Obviously going into basics, like cyberbullying and stuff. Yeah. But as support, especially for a man, myself, I tend to go on there a lot, and there's a lot of, like with the video you showed about the experiment industry, and there's a lot of those going on, especially with the younger generation as well, and how they perceive it. And I'm just wondering, is that kind of where some people have their own, where everything's so complex, everyone has their own branch of full support, and I think some people now, especially the new generation, tend to talk to their digital crowd, their second life, and they share their experiences through there. but also gets branched out to the media, the way things, because you can't really control something once it's online because it's all these complex routes shared domestic.
That's really interesting, and I think, yeah, I mean, that could, it's not something I've kind of identified as a way things are going, but it's definitely a way things could go, and particularly if that interacted with gender. So it might be that men prefer that avenue of support because it's much more anonymous.
Yeah,
and doesn't involve you getting in a room and pouring out your feelings in front of a fellow person, which many men feel uncomfortable doing. So it's about, it ties into that other, the point I made earlier. It's about designing and administrating and funding appropriate services that will take into account the lived experience of victims. So if that's part, if that could be part of that, then I see no reason why it couldn't be. That's a really interesting point. Thank you.
One of the things I found slightly incongruent when you said these are the things that we associate with masculinity, these are the things we associate with femininity. So it makes sense that masculine is going to be the perpetrator and it makes sense that feminine is going to be the victim. One I found incongruent, and I think is interesting, is emotion. You'd think that being violent was an emotional thing to do. And it seems that that's been one of the things we've done in the way we look at violence, or so look at abuse, where abuse is talked about, is we've taken emotion away from it and go, somebody who's been abusive, losing their temper, losing control, is not being emotional, and therefore they're being calculating, like Moriarty. And therefore emotion's good, because emotion's on the feminine side, emotion's good, and violence is bad. Or we would agree that violence is bad, but you'd also agree that violence was something emotional, ordinarily, you think it was something.
Well, for me, it could be less tied into whether it's involving emotion or not, and more tied into how that emotion is expressed, managed, outletted.
Yeah.
So it could be that, there's the same, many studies show that self-reported emotion is very different to felt emotion. So men and women have very similar physiological reactions in terms of empathy, but they express it very differently.
Yeah.
So it could be that men express their emotion, do that aggression in that way, and women do in a different way. So it's not so much that men are emotionless, and maybe that was slightly misconstrued on there. It's not so much that men don't have emotion and women do have it. It's that the way that we channel that emotion, the way that we express that emotion, our willingness to talk about things about emotion, and the way emotion might manifest within those acts might be very different.
Yeah. Well, another thing I was going to pick up in Friends, even though the definition of Friends was dealing with that.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things is she didn't realise, she didn't know that she was hurting him, and that was one of the things. She had no agency in that story because she still didn't know. So she's
You're totally right.
So that was the way that character was portrayed. Obviously,
yeah.
as a comedy, it would probably been less funny if she'd actually been seriously violent in a way.
Because it is Friends, obviously, it's meant to be gentle. But you're completely right. So we focused on the fact that men often don't realise they're victims. But that's very much the case, and the other example I would use is things like harassment. So it's very hard to figure out whether men are harassed or not, because often they don't realise that what they are receiving constitutes harassment, because it just hasn't been told to them in that way. The story hasn't been created, and it's the same for female perpetrators in a way, where they're kind of thinking and not even realising what they're doing is perpetration because they haven't had that dialogue, or there's been no representation of that in any model or anything like that. I completely agree, because I think now that I've thought about it more, I've been harassed when I've been out, but I've never viewed it as harassment. And I think many men would feel like that. They have might have our bums pinched on the dance floor or something like that. And if you think about it, a good thing to do for everybody is to just think what would happen if the genders were switched here, and you'd be like, oh, if I was a woman, I'd be really annoyed because my bum's just been pinched. Whereas with a man, we're like, oh, we just have to get on with it because it's not even harassment, or even if it is harassment, then we should just get on with it. So yeah, you're
Okay, I think time for just maybe another one or two questions.
Just an observation again, we're using the word perpetrator. Perpetrator means guilty of a crime. That word has been chosen very carefully. So we work with abusers who have not been convicted and perpetrators that have been convicted. Okay. And another interesting little facet is that in the last two weeks we've come across two cases where the individual was found not guilty in a court of law on the beyond reasonable doubt, but was found guilty of the same things in the family court where on the balance of probability was the rule. And of course the person holds the not guilty concept of the court against the guilty version of the family court. but we do need to separate out abusers and perpetrators because everybody's being cast as a perpetrator, guilty until they can establish their innocence, whereas fundamentally, of course, they're all innocent until.
And that's a symptom of the language in academia. So that's just my manifestation of the language, and maybe that is also something we should look at, because it does help to reinforce our ideas about domestic abuse and domestic violence. Like, language is so important in how we perceive all of these things, and that could also contribute, especially to making it seem like a clear-cut thing, which is exactly what you said before. It can be much more intimate part of terrorism. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, I think a final question.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I made this point clear earlier, that men do support each other, but they don't support each other when they're in crisis.
Yeah.
That's been my experience, that's what I found. It's like, and it may be because of those gendered stereotypes of unpredictable, possible violence, or just how men deal with emotion.
Yeah, and because also the way that, because I've done a lot of research on pro-social behaviour, so being good and being nice, and the way men are nice is very, very different to the way women are nice. It's not that either does any of it more, which has been a common misconception. And I did a focus group with 12-year-olds, which was very challenging, and they said that I did one with boys, one with girls, and one mixed. And we talked about how boys would emotionally support each other. And the boys were like, well, if it was like your best friend and they just came to you and they're like, Nana died, I'd like talk to them and maybe like pat them on the back. And if it was in a group, I'd maybe like make a joke about their nan being dead. So boys use humour as pro-sociality and to try and lighten the mood and to try and be helpful, whether that is actually helpful or not. And in those periods of crisis, I think we need to do more to kind of instill it in boys not to panic with emotional expression, or to channel their emotions in different ways, or to deal with those emotions. But the point I made before, and I've just taught a whole module on it, is about all the systematic barriers that we put in front of boys in terms of expressing their emotion and in terms of expressing things that are traditionally feminine. You know, parents actively lead their boys away from emotional expression during things like story time and reading books. They're much more focused with boys on the outcome. You know, what did this do? How has it ended? Whereas with girls, like, how do you think that the characters feel? So we do socialise and we do teach our boys and girls to think about emotion differently and to use it in different ways. So yeah.